Chapter 4 Fortune. Idle beneath the rapidly scrolling overhead of red clouds and wind like a screaming banshee, Alex stared with anonymity into the sickening blood moon peering through the cracks. Unable to whisper or change the direction of his thoughts, chaotic will fueled the desire within him to destroy. His physical body was non-existent to the wind, untouched by its slashing air, but prone to the weight of oppression emitted from the abyss. A nauseating trigger in his gut slithered over every pore of his skin, forcing him to crumble to the earth in agony while the sky slowly shattered like glass. The very structure of this world rained nightmare-filled shards of supposed reality to the ground, resulting in the ground itself to snap and fall into another sky beneath his feet. Down he fell in an infinite loop of red clouds, until his body reached such an immense speed that the pressure began to crush his internal organs, making it impossible to scream. The terribly fast rush of air passing by his head had burst his eardrums and nullified any heat in his body. The torture continued endlessly, falling and falling until all he knew became a blur. Then, as if the previous events had not existed, Alex found himself standing once more, this time at the doorstep to his apartment. Unlocked, he opened it slowly with a light touch, revealing a blinding light. In that light stood a silhouetted figure unrecognizable as anything more than a shadow. A hushed whisper, barely audible in the emptiness, reached out to him. The aggressive blaring of his telephone threw Alex into a state of panic as he was ripped out of his nightmare. Both feet launched themselves upward with a startling noise, smashing his shins into the underside of the coffee table. "Fucking hell!" he exclaimed as he leaned forward and used the table to hoist himself up. The moment he became vertical, a crippling blood rush went straight to his head and threw his balance in every direction. At the same time, his legs attempted to identify the new pain. He managed to catch himself by taking hold of the couch arm and leaning on it, gripping his forehead with a searing headache. With half-closed eyes, he scanned the dark apartment for anything out of the ordinary. A foreboding sense hovered over his head, unleashing an alarm of paranoia that was accompanied by the still ringing phone. Everything he saw was out of focus, moving without going anywhere, and a generally fictional feeling. Unable to process anything, his body left his mind behind and staggered towards the phone. Stumbling over a few crushed cans and boxes of takeout, he arrived at the divider wall and placed one hand on the wall for support and the other on the phone. He hesitated at first, taking a few seconds to look past the wall into the kitchen and witness the destruction that had occurred, inflicted by his subconscious. The fridge door was open, leaking cold air onto the floor, which itself was covered in dirt, paper, and a strewn-about loaf of moldy bread. Before answering, he took a deep breath and cleared his throat while wearily looking behind him. The only window in the living room was on the wall just on the other side of the couch and overlooked the parking lot. The curtain he had covering the window ensured it was dark inside, and the state of the world was a mystery. Another ring did not shake him from his concern as the memories of the blood clouds resurfaced. Anxious, he considered the possibility of his nightmare persisting here. Another ring, and finally he ripped it from the hook and pressed the speaker to his ear. "Hello?" he grumbled. "Morning, sunshine," a gravelly voice greeted him. "Paul, what are you doing calling me so early?" "Ah, jeez. Don't tell me you just got out of bed," he groaned. "I didn't just get out of bed, as long as my couch isn't considered a bed," Alex joked in monotone. "Jesus Christ. I call you up with good news, and here you are at 1 in the afternoon shaking off a hangover." I only had 1 beer. Maybe 2. As he said this, he peered past the wall into the kitchen and searched the counter for the bag he brought in last night, only to find the bag on the floor and the bottle standing upright beside the sink, half empty. "Look, I don't care about last night. I'm calling you now to let you know I spoke with Cagney." His attention was drawn back to the call. "What did he say?" "Well, it seems like parents all over the country are doing a better job at raising their kids because he's actually short-handed. You've got a job starting Tuesday." Alex looked at the small, torn-apart calendar tacked to the wall beside the phone and found the date. "But it's only Friday. What am I supposed to do till then?" The words left his mouth and he realized how unappreciative that sounded. Work on your damn people skills, you jackass. You're right, he lowered his head. I'm sorry. Thank you. I mean it. Paul held his breath and then let it out slowly. Kid, you're young. I know you have a lot going on in that fragile little mind of yours, but you can't screw this up. Not even for me or your aunt. You've got to get it together for your own sake. Life doesn't often give second chances. Alex remained quiet, really listening to what he was saying, although each word had to pass by a murky barrier built up in his hazy mind. Still, the message got through. He then rotated his body and leaned his back against the wall, scanning the living room. There were so many thoughts going through his head, so many questions left unanswered, and so many concerns he was unable to vent. Perspective was thrust upon him in those few seconds, and a shift in his thinking occurred. He had to fix this. He had to be better than his depression. Paul, he murmured, I'm still here. Why did you do this for me? There are plenty of other guys out there who can do what I do, but better. I always fuck myself over, and even still, you kept me on. Kept giving me work for the better part of 4 years. Even when I... Stop. Paul cut him off. Boy, you have been drinking, haven't you? He chuckled to himself. Alex was quiet still, stuck in a perpetual loop of self-loathing. Just tell me why. A large, airy sigh came through the muffled static of his phone and filled his ear. Then a tender voice followed, a tone he had not ever heard from Paul unless he was on the phone with his young daughter. I don't know if you know this, but I'm old. I've seen many faces. So many kids and adults alike who got down on their luck, hit the lowest point they can get, and never recover. Now, I'm a firm believer that everyone needs to hit rock bottom at least once in their life to truly find themselves. But you've been there for a while, just like your mother. Alex audibly chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. What? Paul asked. Nothing. It's just, people keep bringing her up when I just want to forget. Forget? I should throttle you. You gotta do everything in your power to keep her close to your heart. Otherwise, she will be gone forever. Why do you even care? His voice boomed. The lingering alcohol in his system took hold of his tongue. Despite the frustration in his voice, Paul kept his cool. He didn't get agitated or make a joke. He spoke with sincerity. Because she and I were like family once, and she hit rock bottom harder than I've ever seen. All the bruises, the shaking in her bones. She never gave up on James. She loved him. Now, hating people isn't in my blood, but I'll tell you what, I hated your father. I hated him and everything he stood for, but there was nothing I could do to change her mind. I took you under my wing, gave you a chance time and time again because I know she's still there, hanging on tight within you. Alex licked his lips, trying to formulate a response while, at the same time, distracted by the image of her face in the back of his brain. He searched the recesses of his mind for the discarded memory of his father and discovered the moment where everything went horribly wrong. The scene played in his head repeatedly in a sped-up fashion, all the details skipped over but not forgotten. He sighed. Do you know the full story? Why my mom finally stood up to him and got his ass thrown in jail? It took him a second to answer. No, I don't. He stated in a cold, almost isolated voice. It was my fault. No surprises there. I broke into his liquor cabinet and brought one of his bottles to school to share with my friends. It was really an attempt to make this girl like me. Cassidy, I think. He spoke slowly while rubbing his neck, lightly cradling his head. We planned to meet under the bleachers in the gym, but they never showed up. So I started drinking it myself and then wandered through the school until I found them. From what they told me, I ended up breaking her arm and knocking another kid out cold. I passed out and was rushed to the hospital where I almost died of alcohol poisoning. After they let me go, my parents were put under investigation. Not to mention I was expelled from school. My dad beat my ass so hard that he ruptured my pancreas, sending me right back to the hospital. That's when my mom finally confessed to all the horrible things he had done. His voice was wavering by the end. Every vein in his body pushed hot blood in circles, causing a discomfort and forcing him to tap his feet and twist various limbs until they cracked. The entire conversation brought so many negative emotions to boil, but the sadness was contained. Paul was quiet still, listening adamantly to the story and connecting dots in his own memory, perhaps allowing past guilt to cloud his mind. I guess my hatred for him wasn't just conjecture, Paul whispered. Alex raised his head and scanned the apartment again. This time, his eyes got stuck on various empty bottles around the room. A pinch in his gut pleaded with his better judgment to let it go, abandon this illness within for something more. But the weight of his memories did what it did best, convince him otherwise. Well, that was a bit more of a conversation than I really hoped for today, Paul awkwardly chuckled. Snapping back to the phone call, he averted his eyes to the curtains drawn over the window. Yeah, sorry. Don't be. Just do me a favor. What's that? Stop hiding at the bottom of a bottle. Things will get better if you kill your vices. Alex didn't say anything, only nodded. Before I go, do you have a pen? I need you to write down the address. Paul suddenly gave a grinding wheeze and cough before clearing his throat again and taking in a deep breath. Alex quickly searched the immediate vicinity and found a pencil and some graph paper on the kitchen counter. Sure, go ahead. All right, you need to be there at 9 in the morning to get a briefing. He said you're going to help replace the gymnasium floor for this community college. I guess it got a lot of water damage or something. The address is 9529 Weston Lane in Oakhurst. Oakhurst? That's like a 45-minute drive one way, Alex griped. Quit your bitching. That dinky car of yours can handle it, and the gas is usually pretty cheap out there. He sighed, continuing to jot down the address. Whatever you say. Damn straight. Now, Jim is going to meet you there and fill you in. Just do as he says, be sober, and keep the sarcasm to yourself. I can't guarantee you'll get more work with him after this, so don't stop looking on the side, he instructed. Right, Alex said as he rolled the pencil between his fingertips and switched the phone to his other ear. I'm going to let you go, kid. I'll be in touch with him in a week or so and see how you're doing. I'll also call you and get your opinion, okay? Sounds good. Thanks again. The phone clicked, leaving him in an aimless state. Slowly, he returned the phone to the hook and folded the piece of paper, making sure to slide it into his wallet, then delegate so many useless thoughts to the back of his brain. There was a lot going on in his head, enough to make the room spin in 2 directions at once. It was still early for him, and his body was tormented by hunger and spasm pains that had no apparent origin. He took a moment to stretch as hard as he could until random joints popped into place. Stumbling away from the phone, he re-entered the living space and brushed by the coffee table, placing his feet just below the wide window. Taking hold of the dirty brown curtain, he peeled it to one side and allowed the harsh yellow light of the day to enter his apartment. First, he felt the rays lick his skin and tingle his chest. Turning to face his domicile, he witnessed how the soft burn of the sun poured onto the floor and over the furniture. Relishing in the heat, witnessing his space go from dank and dingy to bright and colorful, he felt almost inspired. The loathsome shadows crawled under the couch, and he smiled, but only for a moment. The mid-afternoon sun reflected off the few cars in the parking lot and created many varying reflective rays that bounced around. From where he stood, he could see the entire lot and the main entrance directly beneath him and to the right. With the heat washing over, the stench of trash became more apparent. Noticing this, he unlatched the window and slid it open a few inches. Outside, everything was so quiet. Strange, there always seemed to be a constant noise, whether it be from the neighbors or someone playing music way too loud up the road. But not today. Today it seemed as if the entire surrounding world took a moment to stop and experience this serenity alongside Alex. As if they all knew he stood at the cusp of a new winding road of change, waiting to see if he falls flat on his face or flies. Directly beneath his window was his own car parked exactly where he left it. From here, he could easily see chipping paint on the roof and the crack in the windshield which stretched from the passenger side mirror to the driver's side wiper blade. There was a huge dent in the hood where a windstorm stripped some shingling from the apartment and threw it onto his car. These issues, while frustrating, were merely cosmetic. The real problems lived in its heart and soul. Internally, the belt continuously snapped. The stick shift always gets stuck. The brakes were worn to scraps, and the fuse box was sporadic. When he compiled all this information, he suddenly felt more connected to his car than he ever realized. He identified with it as more than a machine. It was like looking in a mirror. So many things he could fix or get fixed, if he cared to. A rumbling in his stomach urged him to eat something, but as he turned to oblige, he was met with the illuminated catastrophe that was his apartment. The coffee table had at least 7 cans and 4 bottles of new and old beer. The floor was littered with old wrappers and dirty socks, while the couch had a cushion removed and laid on the floor. A part of him shrugged off the mess as just the way he lived, content in contamination, while the other part of him, the one that saw the error of his lifestyle, felt disgusted. A harsh, degrading sigh left him bitter. The hunger of his stomach receded as a new objective became clear. Staring at the window, he used his feet to groggily push some of the trash along the floor into a growing pile. He collected the empty drinks from the table and carried as many as he could over to the sink. One by one, he dumped the molding liquid down the drain, listening to the guzzle and pop of every can as it drained. The extent of his mess began to frustrate him as he looked to his left and noticed even more cans littering the countertops. With a huff, he slid open a drawer beside the greasy oven and pulled out a black trash bag. Within a few minutes' time, he had filled one bag and had grabbed the second one. His new starting location was the kitchen, where he filled one bag on its own of old takeout from the fridge. The next was started with chip bags and disposable plates that ended up piled beside the sink for some reason. That bag was tied up and thrown against the wall by his front door. The next bag was opened wide and quickly filled to the brim with all of the cans on the coffee table, old crusted socks he wouldn't even attempt to wash, more styrofoam takeout, and a couple of broken VHS tapes on the floor beneath the table. This bag held the unbeatable record for stink. Many of the cans he recovered from the table had basically gotten glued to the wood by their own secretions, leaving a thick ring at the base and more crud to scrape off. Tossing that bag beside the door brought his body to a screeching halt. There, he held his breath and observed what he had done. From the day he moved in, he has never felt at home, not even for a moment. This place was just a building with many beds for the criminally disturbed and hopeless. Day in and day out, many horror stories would cycle between these walls. Sudden vacancy was common as death or the law would catch up with his neighbors, making this feel more like a ward or a prison than anything. That being said, those people with shattered lives were the only thing that made this place have a sense of home. He related to them like they were all cut from the same cloth. They were all forgotten by the world, left to rot in this decrepit corner of history. From day one, he didn't care to polish or recycle. Life was just too chaotic to clean, to care for himself or his residents. It's just the way it was. But now, it felt different somehow. Staring at those few wrinkled bags by the door, he half grinned. Perhaps being fired was the best thing to happen to him in a long while. This small feat was not to be disregarded, but not overhyped. Those bags were just the beginning. Stepping away from the door, he walked past the couch and stood in the short intersected hallway between the bathroom and bedroom. He chose the bathroom by taking a step inside and flicking on the light. The small standalone sink to his left, a foot from the door, was completely covered in spit and toothpaste. The metallic knobs and spout had no reflective properties from all the buildup, and his toothbrush lay out in the open. The toilet directly across from the sink on the opposite wall was yellow-tinted and covered in snags of hair. Against the back wall directly ahead of him was the bathtub and shower combo with a hoop ring curtain and a dirty towel as a floor mat. All in all, it wasn't the worst it's ever been. It could wait a little longer. The shower handle squeaked, and the room filled with the sound of bustling hot water. Stripping down to nothing, he piled the clothes with many others and used his feet to push them into the corner. Then he stood himself in front of the mirror and looked at his body and all the scars that decorated his flesh. One such scar was a vertical gash that went down the middle of his collarbone, the result of working in an auto shop and having the jack partially release, dropping a car on him. Thankfully, he wasn't working alone. Another mark forever rested on his forearm, where, just after getting his GED, he did volunteer work and was put on a job repairing cracks in pavement. He showed up to the job stoned out of his mind and wound up burning his arm with hot tar, just to see if it would hurt. Surprisingly, they allowed him to take on other volunteer work after his mom got involved. His favorite was the little fleshy bump in his left bicep. This scar was placed there of his own volition during a stupid bet. The bet was he had to hold the tip of a red-headed flathead screwdriver against his arm for 5 seconds. If he lost, he would have to pay $1 for every second he missed. If he won, he got $1 for every second he held it in total. His record back then was 6. Staring into his own eyes, a sigh of remembrance and shame washed over him. So many memories forever embedded on his skin and soul. Behind the blue of his gaze, there was an incinerating rejection, a constant judgment cast onto himself, by himself. When people looked at him, what do they see, he wondered. Because in his eyes, all he saw was a worthless, pathetic loser with nothing to show for in life. Scrappy facial hair that looked like frayed wires protruding from his cheeks and chin needed to be controlled. The hair on his head almost reached his eyebrows, and was a stringy, greasy mess. Between his face and head, Alex had enough gray patches for someone twice his age. If his mom were to see this mess, she would be so quick to sit him down in the kitchen, drape a towel over his shoulders, and give him a trim while talking about work and all of her little friends. Inversely, if his dad were to see his hair in this state, he would pin him to the ground and use a steak knife to rip his hair from his scalp, then drag his ass down to his guy to give him a tried-and-true military buzz cut. Inversely, if his dad were to see his hair in this state, he would pin him to the ground and use a steak knife to rip the hair from his scalp, or drag his ass down to his guy to give him the tried-and-true military buzz. A haircut he never actually minded, but to this day always gets done. A haircut that he never actually minded and has since kept. Not because his father insisted, but because his mother always said he looked so very handsome. The steam rising from behind the curtains reminded him to get in before his hot water was gone. Pushing off the sink, his stiff body dragged itself over the tub lip and pulled the curtains across the rod. The water spat out at the hottest setting and still left him chilled at his core. Still, it was warm enough to relax his muscles as he went through the motions. The water almost had magical properties that peeled away the layers of guilt and madness with every drop that flooded his body. His mind existed in a swelling pool of blissful nothingness that allowed him to forget his woes and turmoil, if only for a moment. In that time of expanding emptiness, one last consideration bubbled to the surface. There are things in him that have to die. Pieces of tragedy that enable a capricious cycle of atrophy, which will bury him one day. For his own sake, those habits, pains, and misery must be buried first if he is to go on. Paul was right. Change is coming.